Welcome, huge movie fanatic Nate, stopping on by. This time I'm coming your way to review the movie from this year, 2025. I think it most likely released in February of this year, 2025, by the name of Heart Eyes, aka Heart Eyes. I was kind of interested in this when this movie materialized, but because of my feelings about the majority of movies coming out these days, I wasn't expecting too much. I figured I'd just wait because it was kind of like a Screen Gems, Columbia, Sony movie. I figured, well, I'll just wait. This will just show up for free on Netflix in 3 months, so I'm not going to go to the theater to see it. I'm not going to pay to see it, or any additional cost, that is. So I'll just wait 3 months for it to show up on Netflix. 3 months later, it showed up on Netflix, so I checked out Heart Eyes. So traditionally, in the past several years, I haven't thought that much of new movies. But then last year, as you may know, the couple movies. Well, first it started in 23 when the Thanksgiving came out, the Eli Roth film. Although I didn't see it until I think early, 24 on for free or no additional cost on Netflix. So for me, even though Thanksgiving came out in 2023, I saw it last year in 24, and then later on in that summer, I saw a film, or not a film, I guess, because it's digital, but a movie that I've just seen so many times since, and I absolutely love. Probably my favorite movie of the possibly, or one of my favorite movies of the 21st century. Probably my favorite horror movie of the 21st century, In a Violent Nature, came out. So last year, I saw, Thanksgiving, which I, hold in relatively kind of high regard. I was kind of impressed with it, more or less. It followed the formula of the 80s, late 70s, early 80s slashers, and was a pretty good, love letter, to the genre, Thanksgiving. And obviously, I just absolutely love In a Violent Nature for everything that it, does kind of differently and stuff, taking the killer in the woods genre that I love so much, and changing it a little bit, but not so much, and just doing its own thing. Absolutely awesome. So I guess I was a little more, because of those two experiences, I guess I was a little more open to Heart Eyes, and hoping for something in Heart Eyes. Cut to months later when I see Heart Eyes on Netflix for no additional cost. So I'm not going to go too heavy into specifics of the movie, but what I will say is it's very, the trailer was hard to say. Obviously the trailer exposed funny elements of the movie, or whatever, comedic elements of the movie. So it's hard to tell based on a trailer just how much horror and comedy, and what the balance of it's going to be in the final movie. It's very clear off the bat once the movie starts that this is just heavy comedy. As a matter of fact, I'd call this a romantic comedy with horror elements more than I'd call it like a horror film with funny elements. What's interesting about it, and I'm not criticizing it for that, it's interesting how it's kind of more or less a horror, a horror Valentine's Day movie. But it's interesting what it decides to do, and of course, what is Valentine's Day? It's about couples or whatever. So what I guess the makers behind this movie thought, which only makes sense, is, well, we're not going to do a horror movie that's that takes place on Valentine's Day. We're going to do a romantic Valentine's Day comedy, and we're going to sprinkle the horror movie elements over it, which is kind of how I see it, or whatever. Admittedly. And I've talked about this, about movies that were, quote unquote funny, or had funny elements in the past, in movie reviews past, that comedy is a really interesting genre, or comedy in general is just an interesting idea, where there's so many variations, subtle variations of comedy. There's the Chris Farley, personally I can't stand like the Chris Farley stupid, idiotic, just loud, zany, whatever. I don't like the Chris Farley kind of comedy, if you can call it that. And then there's more maybe subtle, sarcastic, maybe British dry humor kind of comedy, and everything that comes in in between, or whatever. There's all kinds of different subgenres of humor in general, comedy, different, so there's annoying comedy, and that kind of gets me to what I'm talking about in this movie. There's like some annoying characters, there's some annoying comedy, but then there's, in my opinion, obviously this is all my opinion because I'm doing the movie review. Obviously, it goes without saying everything that I say in this movie review is my opinion, but in this movie I find some of the comedy to be annoying, some of the characters to be annoying, some of the comedy to actually be funny, like the whole bit where we're not together every time that they're on top of each other or they're in an embrace and the killer shows up. We're not together. I mean that to me is interesting and funny. Like that one time where the girl's on top of the guy or vice versa or whatever outside, and the killer comes out and they're like, or she's like, we're not together. Like I actually laughed. Like that was funny. So it's important to realize that, in my opinion, this movie is, as I said, a comedy, a romantic comedy first, and then a horror movie, in addition to that. And it's an interesting, because back in the day I saw Valentine. What was it, early 2000, or the early 2000s? It might have been no, it was 2001, I think, maybe possibly around Valentine's Day, maybe 2001. The horror film Valentine. While that was more of a traditional, like 80s, early 80s slasher kind of film. And it didn't really have like any more of the, all these kind of movies post-Scream have a little bit of like the comedy or whatever sprinkled in there, or humorous elements. But Valentine was more of like just trying to be the early 80s slasher thing, with the incident taking place at the beginning and the rest of the carnage that ensues throughout the rest of Valentine from 2001 is based on that incident that happens at the beginning of the film. Although there's probably laughs in Valentine, it's not what you'd call a comedy. I'd call Valentine a horror movie or horrible movie, depending on how I feel. Slash, basically first and foremost with maybe laughs in it. I mean, going all the way back to Hitchcock, just because you're doing a horror movie doesn't mean you can't have some laughs and a good time in it as well. So it was interesting, kind of, and it took me by surprise. I'm not saying in a bad way, just kind of more or less a positive way. I was surprised about this film being, because the trailer, I guess, makes it seem, like a horror movie first and foremost with comedic elements. But having seen it, as I've already said, definitely a romantic comedy, mostly with horror elements sprinkled throughout, and as I said, and some annoying characters, some annoying comedy. Like it kind of like a roller coaster of what I would regard as like I say, it's all it's all based on one's taste in regards to humor and or comedy and stuff. But some elements or some scenes that I thought were actually funny, and I think some of the I don't know how to describe it. Some of the more pop culture internet, I don't know if you'd even call it meme, just like, was it internet references? Like, it seems like there was some conversations in the film, maybe in the boardroom meeting with that one bitchy woman. That one woman, that one boss of the main chick, I thought was probably maybe the most annoying character in this movie. But there was a scene where, maybe even more than one scene, but one scene in particular where all kinds of references to, current, whatever, internet culture, e-culture, if you want to call it that, or whatever. And it's just like, and I'm fully aware of, like, this is how young people kind of actually communicate, and like, like meme speak, if you will. And it's kind of disturbing, honestly. It's like it's like, how there's, but what's that word for the more melanated individuals, that, or not that word, but the language, their own, I can't remember what that, it's not eugenics, is it ebonics or something? Like the whole kind of speak for more melanated people that ended up happening in Airplane. They parodied, I can parodied it in June Cleaver's Speaks Jive and all this kind of stuff. It's almost like what they're doing to the whole young generation is making this their own completely different language, and it goes across. It's not just for any kind of particular, race or anything. It's like across the whole generation of, they speak in whatever, short speak, internet speak, what the hell is that called? I forgot what the hell I just said, but meme speak or whatever, and just all of these freaking references where it's almost like if you're above 30, you might not understand a lot of it. I think I understood most of it, pushing 50, but the one thing, I guess, so I guess I'm praising this movie more so far, but honestly the horror aspects of this movie, and I'm so, at this point, like, I'm so one of the things that I loved about in a violent nature, while it does use some, computer generated, enhancements or smoothing over of some of the gore effects. At least I think they tried to go more or less practical physical gore effects within a violent nature. And one thing I'm so over is computer generated gore these days, and I can only assume a lot of the gore in this movie was computer generated. And it's just like, although I guess there's some stuff you can't do any other way or whatever, or just I just, when I see computer generated imagery for stuff that could probably be pulled off, in a non-computer generated way, it just makes me grumpy, because in my opinion CG, computer generated movie effects is just like the lazy way to do stuff or whatever. But I'm not the biggest on CG gore and this kind of stuff. And actually, honestly, the horror, while I kind of was pleasantly in a way kind of surprised or caught off guard, I guess mostly positively, by the fact that it's a romantic comedy. Surprisingly a romantic comedy first and foremost, talking about the horror elements. I wasn't too impressed with the horror elements of this movie. The main character I don't really like his kind of cobbled together leather mask thing, and is kind of, I'm assuming he's got like leather kind of outfit or trench coat, whatever. I don't really like the killer's look or whatever. But one thing I will say is that they saved the light up eyes for, I guess, was it like midway through the movie or something? And this is like is it like somewhere around 90 minutes? It seemed longer, but it kind of seemed longer than it is, probably because of all those like some of those annoying characters and just some of that exhausting cultural references scenes that they had sprinkled throughout. Was it just one of them, or was it maybe more than one of them? But whatever. But so the horror elements of this movie I didn't really like, and I'm not going to try my best to not spoil the ending at all. I'll just simply say to not spoil the ending. I wasn't a fan of the ending. It kind of borrows from, I can't really say this without spoiling it, so I won't say, but it kind of borrows from more recent, I guess they're not even that recent at this point, we'll just simply say I'm not the biggest fan of the ending. And movies like this that always feel like I'm not even going to say that because that could be a spoiler. We'll just simply say I'm not a fan of the way this movie ended. And when it kind of ended early, it was not really over, and as a movie pretends to end, I'm kind of spoiling shit. So anyway, I'll just simply say I'm not the biggest fan of how this movie ended. I was I guess we can simply say that, and I can stop saying it over and over if my OCD lets me do so, or obsessive compulsive persuasion, OCP. But Heart's Eyes, yeah, I thought maybe the first half I was more on board with it, but kind of what it does maybe in the last half, I was like, yeah, because maybe halfway through I was like, I'd buy this for $15, but I think by the time it was over, I'm like, maybe I wouldn't go over 10, and even then I don't think I'd be in any kind of rush to buy this movie, because I'm not the biggest romantic comedy enthusiast, and that, as I've already said, probably more oftentimes than needs to be said in this movie, this movie is first and foremost a romantic comedy. So I did think, before I end the review, one thing I will say, to actually say something positive about this movie, is I was actually surprised, and this goes in line with the romantic comedy aspect of this movie. I was actually surprised and kind of impressed with how they actually handled the two main characters, the blonde chick and the Mr. Handsome, love interest guy. And although obviously this movie kind of whatever, I guess, what's kind of interesting about this movie is, like, obviously it's 2025, and you expect these movies to kind of have the women power and kind of downplay the men. This movie actually kind of, it started that way, where it was like woman rejecting men, and then and it was kind of like going along with the lines of what you'd expect. But then there was a scene where the woman's like, oh, you know what, I'm sorry about that, I screwed up, whatever. And it's almost like, wow, this movie kind of started to go the direction you'd expect it these days, but then it had the female character actually kind of apologize and change her trajectory, and kind of change her ways of thinking, her worldview about just love in general, or men in general, or whatever. And I found it kind of interesting in this day and age we find ourselves in, where so many movies and media is just kind of like, propping up women and treating men in movies and television shows and stuff like just dirt and whatever. So this movie actually kind of almost seems like it was written by someone who wanted to try to kind of, challenge that, or maybe start with that kind of point of view and then kind of shift it and be like, oh, let's go from this bitter woman who doesn't, doesn't have any faith in, ever meeting a decent guy or whatever. We can have like a nice guy actually enter her life, and she's a bitch to him, and then, maybe kind of is like, God dang it, I was sure a bitch, and then kind of, repent, if you will, and, change her mind about the situation and stuff. So the thing that I found most interesting about this movie, as I said, is it was unexpected that, like, the love story and the two characters, the blonde chick and the romantic male lead or whatever. I mean, I found myself, and a credit to the movie and the writing or whatever, I found myself more interested in just their story, honestly, than any of the horror elements that were going on in this movie. So, kudos, to the writers, I guess, writers/writers of this movie for, I guess, surprising me, starting with something that was going to look like maybe be a little more what you'd expect in 2025, and then kind of maybe shifting it over to maybe a little more old-fashioned kind of a thing. And I really appreciated, like, the makeshift, drive-in theater, aspect that you've seen in this movie, and the fact that they were actually, I don't know if this would really happen, I can't imagine anyone being interested in a movie this old, but actually showing, actually showing in this movie them, like, this makeshift drive-in theater situation of actually showing, the old classic film, His Girl Friday at this Valentine's Day drive-in thing. And what I think is so ironic about that scene is it, based on how, like, as horror ensues, it seems like the film gets, stuck and, like, melts or whatever on the screen, and it's like, 2025, what projector is going to be, 35 millimeter? I just think that was so funny. And also, the aspect ratio for the old film, His Girl Friday is not 1:8:5 or whatever. It's more the 1:3:3 aspect ratio. So whoever was projecting that movie in the drive-in screen, they projected it at the wrong aspect ratio. But it was surprising in a horror movie, kind of a Valentine's Day horror movie from 2025, to actually have, that movie being heavily featured in the drive-in scene. Is it just the one scene? Possibly. So that was appreciated, and actually I watched this with Beth as well, and I was very surprised to have her name drop the film before I said anything about it. She's like, is that His Girl Friday? And I'm like, wow, I've taught you well. That is, in fact, and I think I only showed her that movie once, and it was probably years ago to boot, and it's like, wow, very, very good, young Padawan. It is, in fact, His Girl Friday that they're watching, but that I digress. But anyway, I guess in closing, that's my thoughts about this film. The horror aspect takes a back seat to the surprisingly, in my opinion, interesting and kind of, I guess that's it, interesting and surprising kind of couple/love story, and well, how perfect for Valentine's, a horror movie or something that was kind of branded or marketed as a Valentine's horror movie, to actually kind of play a switcheroo on the viewer and say, well, this isn't going to be the, although I'm not a big fan of Valentine's Day, other than the fact that it did make such classic films as, well, I guess I should say such classic, because of the holidays, such classic films such as the original My Bloody Valentine exist. I don't have to be a fan of the holiday Valentine's Day to appreciate the fact that the movie takes advantage of the holiday Valentine's Day and builds this kind of interesting, who would have thought this would have ever happened, kind of love story around this, movie marketed as a Valentine's Day horror movie, and do a surprise kind of a love story kind of a thing that no one would have ever thought would happen within the confines of the marketed as a Valentine's Day horror film. Although I'm praising it all this and that so much, I can only go as high as, what the hell. I guess I can go 2.5 stars out of 4 stars for Heart Eyes. And yes, you may have seen the eyes light up in the trailer. I'm pretty sure they only light up once, but if you do something over and over and over, it's less impactful. So if they just do it once and they wait until halfway through the movie or more to do it, it's more of an impactful situation. But Yeah, it's something, you know, that I don't necessarily see myself needing to watch, you know, with so many classic horror movies and stuff that I grew up with, and even recent old movies that I'm discovering and things, and your occasional In a Violent Nature or Thanksgiving coming out to enjoy. Fingers crossed for Thanksgiving 2. Gosh, I hope that's as good as Thanksgiving 1. And if it isn't called like Thanksgiving second helpings, I'll be very disappointed. But I guess that pretty much does it for my review of Heart's Eyes. Not, you know, not what you'd expect, but I kind of appreciate it. Kind of did a twisty turny thing, and a lot of different kind of subgenres or, you know, versions of humor sprinkled throughout the movie. Some annoying humor, some actually funny humor in my opinion, and some humor that's, I guess, neither here nor there or whatever. So I guess that pretty much does it for my review. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, we'll catch you on the next video.